Somos Viña.
We are Vineyard.
Part of what James says, what Romans says, what Paul says in Galatians is God doesn't care what people look like. Now, that is perhaps the most anti-Roman statement in the whole Bible. God is no respecter of persons. God doesn't distinguish one person from the next in terms of status and importance. That's what that phrase means. That would be anarchy in the Roman world. There was a Roman statesman named Pliny. He was giving advice, congratulating a new governor, and he says, hey, I just want you to be careful because there's some people in this kind of position. They try to cozy up to their inferiors to get in their good graces. They try to kind of get too buddy-buddy with their superiors. And he says, I know why people do that, but it's dangerous. And he has this famous saying, he says, the most unequal thing is the appearance of equality where it doesn't exist.
Wow.
And his point is society is in this fragile pyramid. And if we start to pretend like classes don't exist, the whole thing will come crashing down. People could practice equality within a class, but to practice equality between classes was anarchy and chaos. And here we have the Jesus people saying God doesn't care about class.
Welcome to the We Are Vineyard podcast, conversations to help us grow with Jesus and each other. Today's episode is the last in the three-part series on ordination. And Vineyard USA's Associate National Director of Theology and Education, Caleb Maskell, will be talking with return guest Nijay Gupta. Nijay is an author and professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary. Let's listen in.
So, Nijay, it is so good to have you back on the We Are Vineyard podcast.
Thank you, Caleb. It's a pleasure. I had this podcast as one of my, wish list. I want to have a conversation with Caleb about this. So this is great.
Man, I was so excited when you wrote to me because you've written this new book, and I want to get right into it. It's called Strange Religion: How the First Christians Were Weird, Dangerous, and Compelling. Now, a lot of folks might talk about Christians now in one of those ways, or maybe even two of those ways, but not always all three. So I guess the question, I'd love for you to just over the next half hour or so, just talk us through the book. But let's start here. Why did you decide to write a book like this?
Yeah, well, let's start with the word weird. When I use the word weird here, I don't mean hairstyles or music tastes. I'm using it as kind of a social scientific category of deviance. Whether it's religious, cultural, moral, whatever it is, social deviance. Whenever we're talking about deviance, we're talking about people breaking away from the pack. We're talking about people doing something different than the dominant culture. And this book comes out of some of my experiences during the pandemic, and especially during some of the political issues since 2016. I live in Portland, Oregon, largely unchurched, to some degree anti-Christian environment. And the reputation that Christianity has amongst my neighbors, people that don't go to church, but that know about Christianity from the news, especially evangelicals, is Christianity is either boring, old-timey, or it actually reflects and amplifies the worst of dominant culture. Sexism, greed, arrogance, abuse, you name it, racism. And I know what they're talking about because they're just looking at the news, all these scandals.
Sure.
They know that there's some pastors that are wearing expensive sneakers and jewelry and driving in expensive cars. They have that sense that the people that Christians love, that evangelicals love specifically, are the worst of society. There's some of that. I might be exaggerating a bit, but that, if I tell people, hey, I teach pastors, here in Portland, that doesn't go over very well.
It's like the worst of the mainstream, like the worst of the dominant culture. Yeah.
Yes. And if you look at any time there's crossover between a political candidate that's an evangelical, you can see what people's, how they feel about how at least left-leaning people here in Oregon, Portland, feel about those people. Now, when we look at the Christians in the first century, and this is kind of my day job as I'm studying Galatians and Philippians and Ephesians, we're talking about not the center of the pack, right? If evangelicals in some ways are the center of the pack of culture in materialism and some other things, but if we're talking about the ancient world, we're talking about people that stepped away from the dominant culture in radical ways on almost every level. certainly religious, but political, social, moral in the eyes of Rome, and other things. And what does it take? So I think about this in every generation, whether it's like a Gandhi or a Dietrich Bonhoeffer or Martin Luther King Jr. You think about those great heroes of society who transform society through a new movement. And what does it take? What kind of inspiration does it take? What kind of guts to say, I'm going to step away from the pack. I'm going to do things that will get me in good trouble. Like, that will, that sort of thing. That's what we're seeing with early Christianity. In some ways, that's the inverse of the reputation Christianity has in America and the parts that I've lived in. And so I guess the question at the heart of my book is, would our spiritual ancestors recognize us as their true descendants?
Ooh, that is a deep question. That is a very deep question.
And after researching, I would think that generally speaking, they would think that we capitulated.
Yeah.
Not in every single way. And maybe they'd be like, oh, you got iPhones. That's great. But I think generally speaking, they're going to say, what happened to the Jesus way? What happened to the Jesus way? Now, that's not every tradition. That's not every Christian. That's not every church. I think there are cracks and spots in Christianity where we see moments of that early radical distinctiveness of the Jesus way. But what my book tries to do is to basically transport us, grab us, put us all into the DeLorean, take us all back to, AD 50, AD 80, AD 99, and say, what was the battery inside these Christians that was driving them to be culturally deviant, weird, dangerous in a Roman Empire that strove for conformity? Rome wanted conformity.
Yeah.
That was the goal, conformity to the glory of Romanness, to increase the height of its glory and the breadth of its conquest. So that means everybody's got to toe the line. So that's the dangerous part. But then you have Christianity gaining ground and creating a following, creating a movement. And so that's the compelling part. And I want to say our Christians today, weird in the right ways, dangerous in the best ways, and truly compelling.
I mean, those are about the most important questions for certainly anyone in ministry, anyone in Christian leadership, but frankly, anybody who's wondering, what does it mean to bear witness to the Lord Jesus in the world today, right? Yeah. And I mean, by training, I'm a historian of American Christianity, so I've spent a lot of time studying the way that Christian faith sort of has been located in modern American context. And as I read your book, I mean, I was so struck by the profound differences in certain ways between the Roman context and the American context from, the 17th century all the way to the present. And yet there are some eerie similarities. Yeah. It's like the scripture says there's nothing new under the sun. So why don't we just go right in there? Why don't you take us to first century Rome and talk to us about the way that religion worked and the way that Christians showed up weird and dangerous and compelling?
Yeah, let's start with Roman religion. I used to think, you learn so many things in college and, graduate school, from graduate school. I had some vague notions. The Roman Empire was polytheistic. They have lots of gods. That's true. They did have lots of gods, hundreds and hundreds of gods. What I didn't realize until I researched this book is there's actually a pecking order to the gods. It's not sort of anything goes. And so I explain the Roman world as a great pyramid of power. And at the top are the few with the greatest power, and at the bottom are the many with the least amount of power, sort of the 99%, the 1%. So, and they didn't recognize a material spiritual divide. They knew that the gods lived in some other existence, but they also believed that both these worlds were interconnected. And the idea was you have these great gods at the top, the great Olympians like Jupiter and Juno and all of that. And then below that, you have, demigods, and you have deified, emperors, humans made gods. And then at the very bridge or line between heaven and earth, you had the the emperor, Lord Caesar. He was referred to as the Pontifex Maximus, the great bridge builder between heaven and earth. And then below that, you had great humans in the minds of Rome, like senators, equestrians, elites, right? And then you had commoners. And at the very bottom, you had slaves, low-wage workers, criminals, immigrants, the disabled, that sort of thing. And Rome loved conformity to keep everybody wanting to be like the people at the top, but never actually able to achieve that. There was this hunger for, okay, it's like watching Lives of the Rich and Famous, when we were young. You aspire to that, but you're not going to have a yacht and a massive house and all of that.
Right.
And so if God's come into that world, let's say from Egypt or from a part of the Mediterranean, they're allowed in. It's almost like immigration. They're allowed in as long as they conform. They have to find their seat. You get 32A in the mezzanine section. You find your seat in the pyramid, and you definitely don't challenge Olympus.
Yeah.
You definitely don't challenge Jupiter, who's called best and greatest, and you don't question, Lord Caesar and all of that.
So there's a whole pecking order that really covers the entire society. And at the top of it, you've got like gods like Jupiter, the gods that we've heard of, right?
Yes.
And then below that, is that like Artemis of the Ephesians, like how we see in Acts? And then below that, you end up sort of in the human realm, all the way on down to the kind of the scum of the earth in the Roman eyes, essentially.
Yeah, but sometimes you could overstep. So like with Artemis of the Ephesians, you could say, we think she's the best. And then you say, oh, but do you mean better than that? You kind of looked out. You didn't mind competition, but you looked, Roman officials would probably be concerned if it got too out of hand. You want to keep some checks and controls on those sort of things. It was kind of like sports.
Yeah.
In my book, I actually liken it to sports where, we know the Olympics are really a big deal, but we're more passionate about our local sports. Because it's right here, I can go to the games. So even though it's like, Olympics, that comes around every, 4 years, a World Cup is amazing. But I actually go to my local sports every week. So I know these athletes better than I know those athletes. I think it's something like that.
Okay, got it.
Things that Romans really prized. Oh, yeah. So let me just say, there's some huge differences between religion in the ancient world and religion in America in 2024, specifically Christianity. Today, we kind of think of religion as kind of a choice. Like, I'm going to decide what religion I am, and I might convert to this or I might convert to that. We think of it largely in terms of human fulfillment. Like, what's going to give me the biggest bang for my buck in terms of spiritual satisfaction?
My best life now.
My best life now, right? Yeah. So it's going to be this kind of meditation or this kind of community. It's very choice, convenience, and personal satisfaction. And it's very private. It's like, what religion? Oh, I don't want to answer that question, or I don't want to check that box. Like,
prefer not to answer.
Yeah, it's a personal thing. But if you go to the ancient world, it's the opposite in pretty much all those categories. Most Romans, when I say Romans, I don't mean everybody is Italian. I mean people that are Romanized.
Yeah.
People that are trying to fit in the Roman world. So most Romans, they are obligated to worship the gods. So don't think of the god as your personal genie. My family, we just watched the old Aladdin movie. Nice. God is not your personal genie there to grant you wishes with his superpowers. The gods in the Roman conception are like overlords. They're like cosmic overlords. And they're like colonizers. And so you actually owe them worship. And so there's a phrase that's used in Latin, the Roman world, pax deorum, which means peaceful coexistence with the gods.
Oh, uh-huh.
So you live as a Roman citizen to honor the gods, to, one, prevent wrath. You don't want them to curse you or to whatever, all the bad things that could happen. Number two, to curry favor, to appease them, and maybe to get a benefit. So I kind of liken this to the mafia or a local gang, a neighborhood gang. Think about your neighborhood gang. And if you own a little convenience store, and this gang comes to you and says, hey, you owe us, $500 a week or whatever it is, and we will protect you. Well, that means a couple of things. It means you have to pay it or we'll kill you.
Right. They won't burn your store down. Right.
Yes. And they're going to protect you from rival gangs because they want your money.
Right.
It's very similar to Roman religion.
Interesting.
Where it's not about growing in faith. It's not about morality. Some of the philosophers thought about that, but your commoners didn't. It was really about appeasement and currying favor. And if you got in the good graces of the gods, maybe you could get some benefits. Maybe you could get some privileges. Rome also loved limited access to power. So if you wanted to be close to the gods as a regular person, you needed privilege and money. Why? Because you got to go somewhere to really see the gods. You got to get to a temple. You got to talk to a priest, and you got to bring a sacrifice. And all those things cost money, time, and effort. And and if you really, like, if you were in that world, you would save your nickels and dimes so that one day you could go to Rome. So you could see the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, and you could see all the great temples of Rome. It's like Disney World for us. It's like, I want to go to Universal, see Harry Potter. I want to go this, and you save your nickels and dimes to make it to Orlando, to make it to Anaheim. That's what you do in the Roman world. You can't just worship anywhere. You could try, but why would the gods hear you when you haven't entered into their territory, into their special territory? And so that was kind of the basics of religion.
And so let me ask you a question about this. So why was Rome so invested in that sort of orderly, almost like fixed culture of like what's the benefit for a Roman in that? And then, of course, as the Christians are about to show up, why does it rattle Rome so bad?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest answer is it works. It works. I mean, it's just the assumed practice of ancient people that if you have an earthquake, the gods are mad. And if you lose a war, the gods weren't on your side. And so, for example, you have these professional priests, and they're not priests because they're moral or they're good. They're priests because they're really good at certain activities. So one of them was, for example, was reading the patterns of birds to determine the will of the gods. Another is to cut open an animal and look at its entrails and use that as kind of like reading the tea leaves to interpret the will of the gods. My favorite ritual, which I actually talk about in my book, is called Tripudium, and it's sacred chicken dancing. And it's this idea that you would have these sacred chickens, and before you go into war or make a big decision, you would put food in front of them. And if they ate with a very voracious appetite, that was a positive omen that you were going to be successful. And if they weren't hungry at all and they just were like, they just give up, then it's a bad omen. So there's a famous story of a general, Claudius Pulcher, who was going against the Carthaginians. He takes his chickens with him on his boat, and on his way, he wants to see if he's going to win. So he puts this food in front of the chickens, and famously, they don't eat it. And he gets so mad, he throws the chickens overboard, and he says, if they will not eat, let them drink.
Wow.
He lost against the poor Pulcher lost against the Carthaginians.
See, he should have listened to the chickens and turned around.
He should have listened to the chickens. I should have put that in the book.
That's right.
So the answer is this is the time-honored approach.
Okay.
It's a cause and effect approach to the world. That the gods are invisible, but they will communicate to you through omens, through divination, through prophecy, and through appeasement.
Yeah.
And so if a priest did a ritual incorrectly, you would fire them or kill them, because you have to make sure these things are done letter perfect. I read one source that said for a Greco-Roman ritual, they had four people on hand, one to do the ritual, one to read the ritual, one to make sure the ritual is done correctly, and one to enforce silence of the people observing. So they took this stuff very, very seriously.
No doubt. I mean, it's just incredible to think about the fact that getting the ritual right was more important than the character of the priest. I mean, priests are functionally instrumental, right, to the whole process, which is a scary thought in any time.
Well, think about politics. I don't want to get down here in the muck, but think about politics today. How much of a successful political candidate is dependent on moral character, and how much is dependent on money raised?
Yeah.
We're
thought
pointing,
it was
we're pointing fingers here.
It's not all character. I had heard it was all about character to succeed in politics.
I mean,
maybe not quite so much.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the Christians show up. What happens?
Yeah, this is crazy. So whenever you propose a book to a publisher, especially when you haven't written it, which I never write it before I propose it, it's always a hunch. It's a guess, right? You do some scratchings. You say, I got, I call it Seinfeldisms. Is this something? Is this something?
Is this a thing?
Is this a thing? And I had a hunch that Christians were weird. And then I got into it, and they were almost the opposite of what everybody was doing. So, for example, there's a famous critic of Christianity in 2nd century named Celsus, and I have this quote in my book. He says, "If all people wanted to be Christians, the Christians would no longer want them."
Wow.
And
okay.
His point is they are really bizarre. They're bizarro people. So let me just explain it to you this way. Let's say I came to you and I said, "Caleb, I have an idea for a new kind of restaurant, but it has no table, no chairs, no food, no servers, and no chefs." You'd be like, "Well, it's not." You'd be like, "Well, how is it like a restaurant?"
You wouldn't be able to think about what that.
You couldn't even conceive
that's not
of
a
it.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have these Christians come along, and they, in the Roman world, the infrastructure of religion was temples, priests, statues, and sacrifices, material sacrifices. You had to have a temple because you got to be near a divine hotspot. It's like Wi-Fi, right? You got to be near. My daughter plays volleyball, and whenever I'm at practice with her, it's like in this gym within a gym. There's no Wi-Fi, and I feel like I'm going to die in there, like I'm bleeding out because I have no access to the outside world. Yeah. So it's like that. You got to be near a temple, near a hotspot. Priest. You have to have controlled access to the gods, or else this thing could blow. It's like having a grill without like a dial on it. It's like you got to be able to control it, and the priests control all this. You got to have sacrifices, because if you're going to appease a god, you got to bring a welcome gift. It's like going to a party. You got to bring a bottle of wine. It's nice. It's what you're expected to do. Christians didn't have that. Statues. So the gods to worship in the Roman world was to worship with a statue. And this was almost seen as like an avatar of the god. It was like a conduit of bringing the god into the present moment. Christians didn't have any of those things.
Yeah.
And add on top of that, this whole notion of conforming to Romanness. So one thing I do in my book is I talk about the difference between. So I mentioned Rome had a tolerance policy. Let's check your documents at the border, make sure how did they decide whether religion was good for Rome or not? I had to do a little bit of kind of analyzing across different texts, but they use this terminology of the difference between religio, which is authorized religion, and superstitio, which is dangerous religion.
Interesting.
So authorized religions are ancient. The older the god, the better. They are controlled. They have priests and rules. They are ritualized. And they are kind of like professional in the sense that like there isn't like frenzy. There isn't like ecstasy. It's like level-headed.
They're predictable.
They're predictable.
Yeah.
Yes, predictable. Now you take Christians, and they're like, "How old is your God?" Be like, "He was literally born like 20 years ago." Jesus, they're like, I can introduce you to his mother.
Right.
Like that's a problem.
That's immediately a problem. Yes.
And then you say, "What are your rituals?" And we have baptism and we have the Lord's Supper. They're not exactly the same as religious rituals. They're more like communal rituals. They're not appeasement rituals.
Yeah.
They're not designed to appease the gods. They're designed as community experiences. Baptism is a little different, but and then okay, I would like to meet one of your priests. It's like we don't have any priests at all.
Yeah.
And then like there's some ancient writers that say like when you go to a temple, don't hang out all day. Just like pop in, say your prayers, be good to the god, say thank you very much, and leave. Like this, Plutarch has this whole essay called On Superstition. And he's like, I don't understand Jews, because if God is so affable, good-natured, why do they pray so much in the temple?
No.
If all you got to do is say, thanks for being you, and leave, why do they stay in their temple all the time?
Because he was used to God's being terrifying and needing appeasement rather than like loving and caring.
But also he's saying they seem too desperate. These Jews seem too desperate. They probably would apply that to Christians, because you got people like Paul saying pray continuously.
Yeah.
And I think Plutarch would say the gods are busy. They don't want you talking to them all of the time. So they didn't understand this. But, I think you're probably wondering, where does all this come from for Christians?
Sure.
Where's all this coming from? It's coming from a couple of places. One is this notion that if there is one God, then this one God is a rival to all other gods. I mean, them's fighting words.
Yeah, no doubt.
It's really interesting when you have places in the New Testament that says, like, there's no other name under heaven by which, people can be saved. Or if you have things like Lord of all.
Yeah.
I went looking for text that said Zeus is Lord of all, or Jupiter is Lord of all. And prior to the Roman Empire, prior to Caesar Augustus, gods weren't really talked about that way. Gods are basically regional, and they're competitive.
Interesting.
So they'll say, I'm stronger than you, let's arm wrestle. Like that's what the gods will do. But this idea of a god claiming absolute universal sovereignty.
Yeah.
Aside from Israel, right? They had that, but you just didn't do that. Like that's not the way people looked at the gods. If there are thousands upon thousands of them, who's going to claim superiority over everybody?
Right.
Here the Christians are running around saying Jesus is Lord of all. It's like, wait, are you talking about the same Jesus that died on a cross? That
right.
Was a criminal?
Yeah. Well, that's what's so weird about, like, now I'm using your language, right? I mean, that is what's so weird about this when you start to get into the frame of mind of, like, if I was like a minor Roman authority or something, just trying to wrap your mind around what does it mean that somebody who was born very recently claims, and you have in your book this really interesting little reflection on the Colossians 1 passage about Jesus is the image of the invisible God, and then somehow is both over all and stunningly accessible, not only accessible, but reachable by the empire. Like the empire can and did kill the guy.
Yeah, yeah.
And yet somehow you're saying he's over everything? I mean, it's very astounding.
Is very astounding. And just in terms of the dangerous aspect of Christianity, Rome believed you had to keep this really cool distance from the gods because they're so dangerous. They're so volatile. And I use the example of like fireworks. So in some states, you can just go, around July 4th, you could just go to the grocery store and they'll have a big display of fireworks.
Yeah.
Or there'll be these pop-up stands on the road. You just go buy $50, $100 worth of fireworks and scare the crap out of the dogs in your neighborhood, shooting fireworks off in the middle of the night.
That's right, because of freedom, because you believe in freedom.
Yes, but I lived for 5 years in the great Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Yes, the Commonwealth.
You're not allowed to buy fireworks. As individuals, they have a whole website dedicated to this, basically explaining they're too dangerous for non-professionals to handle. But this is a very good analogy for Christians, because Christians went through what I call a technology revolution. It was kind of like going from dial-up. Do you remember dial-up internet? We're probably the same age.
I remember it well. Yes.
Dial-up with the bings and the bongs. And, what you're doing, for those of you young people who are listening, what you're doing with dial-up internet is you're using your phone line to very slowly get on the internet. Takes like 2 minutes for a page to load. And then you have to get off the internet again in order to keep using your phone. So you try to get on and off, and think about the huge revolution we went through from dial-up to, what is it called? Local area network or something like that.
Yeah.
Fiber optic.
Ethernet.
Yeah, or I use a phone analogy in my book of I was watching Stranger Things, one of my favorite shows, and there was in the first season there was a scene where they're running around a building. This set in the 1980s, and there's a monster chasing them. And I remember yelling at the TV. I was alone in the dark on a Saturday night. I remember yelling at the TV, "Call the police!" And it kind of dawned on me they don't have cell phones.
They can't call.
They don't have cell phones. They have to go to a well. In the Roman world, you had to go to a physical location in order to be sure that you could talk to a deity. And here Christians were saying, so this is the religious technology revolution. You can be no one place in the world is closer to God than another place.
Yeah.
There's no place of privilege in the whole world.
Yeah.
In terms of being close to God. This is what Christians are saying. They're saying, we don't need temples because God's gift is he gave his presence to us. That's crazy. That's volatile. That's dangerous. 3, we don't need priests. Now we can talk about this because some traditions have priests in Christianity, but we don't need priests because Jesus Christ is the always present, always open channel of living mediation. And if a priest's job was to make sure that you get a connection to the deity without anyone getting hurt, creating the appropriate amount of appeasement, what Christians are saying is because of what Jesus Christ has done, God is always happy. God is always in a good mood when he thinks about us. So when you think about a material sacrifice as a way of warming over a deity to your request, it's like if my kids want something from me, they'll be like, "Hey, can I help you carry the groceries?" Or, "Hey, I'll go check the mail for you." Or, they're gonna try to do something to warm me over. And this idea within Christianity, within the New Testament, is because of Jesus, God is always pleased when we approach him.
Yeah,
there's no necessity of appeasement because of Jesus. I mean, that's astounding. Like we come to Jesus and we say, "Okay, can you warm over God?" He's like, "Already done. Did it.
Yeah.
What do you need?" That's where Jesus does the ask, seek, knock stuff, because he's like, you don't have to worry. You don't have to be. Think about Hebrews where he says, "Let us approach the throne of," and you could put so many words there, power, authority, judgment, but it's a throne of grace.
Yeah.
Okay, let's approach the throne of grace with meekness, lack of certainty, self-doubting. No, with confidence.
Confidence, right.
Knowing that my sacrifice is good, I've been a good person. No, that God's gracious and merciful.
Yeah.
Like this would be astounding to people.
It's a complete paradigm shift, right?
Yes.
And I like the analogy of dial-up internet versus like fast Wi-Fi everywhere, because there's something about it where if it's real, it renders everything obsolete that has come before it at some level, which is, I suppose, why it's weird and dangerous and compelling. I mean, there might be an analogy to the way we think about the potential of AI or something like that in our moment, right? Where it's like, oh, this could change things that we haven't even dreamed about yet, especially when you're walking around towns and cities that have temples and sacrificial centers in them. So you're thinking, my goodness, this could upend the economy. This could upend the way we think about the cosmos, all these different pieces, right? So talk to me a little bit about the way that, like, specifically the Christian understanding of the Spirit being present in individuals worked in this sort of shift or this reframing, right? It feels in certain ways like very democratic or very populist or popularizing in certain ways. But then, like, when you read the scripture, it doesn't feel democratic in the manner of anything goes. So talk to me a bit about how that worked.
Yeah, let me talk about in the context of magicians and sorcerers. And so Rome, as I mentioned, loved controlling people. They loved conformity. And they loved controlling the mechanisms and pathways of power. Well, one of the things that was hardest to control was harnessing divine power. And so you had lots of people in the ancient world who claimed to be magicians, but it's probably better to say sorcerers, because we think of like David Blaine or Houdini. We're not talking about illusionists and magicians with like a rabbit trick. We're talking about people who used magical objects like spell books or amulets to curse people. Cursing was extremely common in the ancient world in terms of why you would go to a sorcerer.
Got it.
If you go to India, there are palm readers everywhere. That is super, super popular. And it's very similar to the Roman world. You would have sorcerers on every street corner who of varying levels of success.
Yeah.
You have some that are, they have no clue what they're doing. And you have some that seem to be doing something with what they're doing. And you had them all the time. And Rome kept a very watchful eye. One of my favorite things I researched in the book was something called the Cornelian Law of Assassins and Poisoners.
That sounds cool.
It's a Roman law. It's a Roman kind of amendment or law, set of laws that prescribe very specific punishments for people that can do a lot of damage. So obviously murder, assassination, a lot of damage, but also sorcerers. Why? Because if they're really good at it, they can wield a massive amount of power, uncontrolled by Rome.
Wow.
So think about crucifixion. Crucifixion was known as the slave punishment. This is one of the reasons I think Philippians says that Christ came in the form of a slave. He didn't actually come in the form of a slave, but he died a slave's death on the cross. One of the types of people that were crucified were magicians or sorcerers. That's how much Rome wanted to deter people from engaging in sorcery.
Wow.
Like light sorcery at a party was fine. People did it and they were okay with it. But, any attempt to curse a group of people or do something really powerful was dangerous. So now let's take the book of Acts and the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
This makes a lot of sense of Simon the magician, Simon Magus, who comes to the apostles and says, hey, I got a fat wad of cash and I would love to buy the power of the Spirit from you.
For sure.
And Peter gets really, really mad at him. He says, this is not the way it works. But he's wisely recognizing that these people are wielding massive amounts of power. Think about the book of Acts, I can't remember, maybe chapter 18, where people, if they just touch the handkerchief of Paul or his apron, then they'll be healed of diseases. That is a gigantic amount of power.
Yeah.
Placed in the hands of individuals. I think this is what's happening in Pentecost, is the giving of the Spirit to everybody is a nightmare to Rome. How are they going to keep watching all these people? How are they going to help all these people? Or how are they going to prevent all these people from using that power? Yeah. And this would have been, this is what you're calling the democratization of the Spirit, is saying these people can heal. I've been just reading 1 Corinthians 12 and other places that talk about Christians aspiring to the greatest gifts. Yeah. Meaning they can cultivate these gifts. Some are going to be better than others, but you can cultivate these gifts. And this idea that we're going to have commoners out there with the power to heal. And in Roman minds, if they have the power to heal, they also have the power to kill. Yeah. That is super dangerous.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty wild just thinking about it, putting my pastor hat on for a second. It's pretty wild to think about the fact that Peter and Paul in particular, in the circumstances where it comes up in the New Testament, had the wisdom and the humility to not sort of just fall into what their cultural norms would have been, which is, this is valuable. This is something that I could teach. But they had in them the freely you've received, freely give. I suppose seeing Ananias and Sapphira may have underlined that pretty clearly for them. But it's a profound thought that not only does everybody get it, but that God is working through these folks to give good news to the whole world.
Exactly. And one of the things that a Roman observer would notice is sorcerers, if we look at the records of sorcery in the Roman world in terms of legends and graffiti and other things, more often than not, they're using their powers to hurt people rather than help people, or to manipulate people against what they want, whether it's love potions or making people sick, cursing people, whatever, making them lose their job. When you went to a sorcerer, more likely than not, you're going to them to hurt someone. Now, they had healers. That's a whole different category, like Asclepius and all that. But when you're going to a sorcerer, you want to hurt somebody. When we look at the Christians, there's only one time that someone on the good side does something bad, and that's when Jesus curses the fig tree. I still don't understand that. He's not harming a person, so it's okay, Jesus. But every other time, it's being used in a way to restore something to goodness. And as you mentioned, it's completely free. And this would have been very different. There's some really noticeable differences between Christian healing and Roman sorcery. One is you often used a magical object or a spell in Roman sorcery. And this is really, you might find this really interesting. One of my professors in seminary asked, why do the Gospels sometimes give Aramaic words of Jesus? Like when he healed the young girl, he said, Talitha cum, woman, get up. Why do we need to know what the Aramaic words are? And my professor said, and I actually think this is probably true, he said, so we know Jesus wasn't using a spell.
Interesting.
He's just talking graciously and warmly with his father, saying, little girl, get up. Yeah, nothing special about his words. They're the most common words.
Wow.
Second, they never take money. And third, there aren't these nefarious motives. They want to help and heal people, to restore them to goodness, new creation.
So in a way, it's like
stand out.
It's like de-instrumentalizing the religious practice. In other words, they're not saying we're standing as intermediaries between like what God or God's power could do and the thing you want. But we're actually saying that you're part of a new, probably the Bible language would be new creation. You get to participate in new creation.
And this would be one of the compelling parts. I know you would appreciate this. I don't know if all the interviews I've been would appreciate this, but I think healing would be a very big part of the launching of Christianity.
Yeah.
We get sentiments of that in Galatians, 1 Corinthians. Obviously, it's all over the Gospels, the book of Acts. These weren't just magic tricks. People sometimes treat them as magic tricks. The healings, like, look what I can do. But they're, like you said, they're really signs of a kingdom that blesses and doesn't curse.
This summer, Vineyard USA is hosting our national conference, Seed and Soil, in 2 locations, Denver, Colorado on June 17th through 20th, and Cincinnati, Ohio on July 15th through 18th. We hope that by offering 2 locations and dates, everyone, pastors, leaders, volunteers, even those just curious about the Vineyard, everyone will be able to find a time to join us. The conference will have specific programming for adults, youth, and kids, while we focus on cultivating healthy soil in our hearts and planting seeds for the future for all that God wants to do in us and in the Vineyard. Registration is now open with early bird pricing, so make sure to check out vineyardusa.org to learn more and register today.
So talk to me more about that and along the lines of essentially, why does this thing take off? Because we've talked about how weird it is, and we've talked about how it's troubling to Roman authorities and culture and all those pieces. But obviously, over the first 3 centuries, Christianity absolutely explodes.
Yeah,
healings may be part of it, but just from your research in the book, like, what are the ways you would want us to be thinking about that?
Absolutely. There's so many reasons. You're going to have some people that are more philosophically minded in the ancient world that like some of the Mars Hill kind of discussions that Paul has in Acts 17. You're going to have some people that have a vision or something like that. But I think for a lot of people, their attraction actually comes through encountering a Christian community. We learn from 1 Corinthians that Paul recognizes there are going to be unbelievers in the church who are kind of trialists. So I'm really big into soccer, and sometimes preseason here in Portland, they'll have people practicing with the team preseason to see if they belong. They're called trialists. So I think there's some like pre-Christian trialists in these. They're just trying it out.
Yeah.
And Paul basically says, give them the best opportunity to appreciate what this community has to offer. Treat them well. Explain things to them of what's going on. These are called idiotes, and that doesn't mean they're idiots. It means that they are individuals who are not fully integrated in the community, but that are there.
Interesting.
And so I think there are these trialists who are being invited to churches, and they're witnessing a completely new politic and sociology within the church. So I talk about this in my book in the last couple of chapters about sort of the lifestyle of early Christians. But if you went to a typical Roman dinner party, they are designed to show off status and power. And so you would even be seated at the dinner table based on how important you were in society, with the most important people sitting closest to the host, and then the least important sitting on the ground or sitting even in another room or even sitting in the bathroom. some Juvenal, who is an ancient satire writer, says, you might be seated in a latrine. But you would be invited because it actually makes the elites look more elite if there are, low-class people sitting in toilets in the same house.
Wow. That's a lot of work.
Yeah. And Juvenal says, if you show up, you deserve to sit in the latrine. But they're hoping that they impress somebody they can get a little bit closer to the table. Anyway, but you go to a Christian gathering, let's say an Orthodox, a Jesus way Christian gathering, and they practice status destabilization, meaning James 2 says, hey, someone comes in, they're all wealthy dressed. You say, hey, I got a seat in the back for you. And he doesn't mean, I don't think he means that literally. I think he means you need to short circuit the part of your brain that says, give the rich people the best seat in the house.
Yeah.
And then he says, if there's a shabby person, someone, let's say in a black hoodie, who shows up.
Like me. For the people not watching, I'm wearing a black hoodie. Yes.
I'm going to change into my black hoodie as soon as we're done here. But for the people who are, dressed, more commonly, James says, usher them in the front so you get the best seat in the house. His point is, we got to stop thinking like Rome. We got to start thinking like Jesus. And part of what James says, what Romans says, what Paul says in Galatians is, God doesn't care what people look like. Now, that is one of the most, perhaps the most anti-Roman statement in the whole Bible.
Wow.
God is no respecter of persons. God doesn't distinguish one person from the next in terms of status and importance. That's what that phrase means. And that would be anarchy in the Roman world. There was a Roman statesman named Pliny. He was giving advice, congratulating a new governor. And he says, hey, I just want you to be careful because there's some people in this kind of position. They try to cozy up to their inferiors to get in their good graces. They try to kind of get too buddy-buddy with their superiors. And he says, I know why people do that, but it's dangerous. And he has this famous saying. He says, the most unequal thing is the appearance of equality where it doesn't exist.
Wow.
And his point is, society is in this fragile pyramid. And if we start to pretend like classes don't exist, the whole thing will come crashing down. People could practice equality within a class, but to practice equality between classes was anarchy and chaos. Wow. And here we have the Jesus people saying God doesn't care about class. I mean, so elites aren't going to like that.
Yeah. Well,
a slave is going to find a lot of value in that sort of dinner party. He's like, wait, I get a full meal?
Yeah. So does the church grow initially among non-elites then?
Yeah, Paul says, Corinthians, not many of you are, highborn and elite, meaning majority of them are from kind of the bottom of society. And this is fascinating. I talk about this in my book, Tell Her Story, but I think I mentioned it here as well. Pliny, he has the task of figuring out what's going on with Christianity and reporting back to the emperor. And he interviews two Christians. He interrogates two Christians. And the three things we know about, this is the end of first century, the three things we know about these two Christians are they are deacons, they are women, and they are slaves. That's wild, just thinking, demographically. And then you fast forward to a late 2nd century writer, Minucius Felix, and he writes from the perspective of a critic of Christianity named Caecilius. And Caecilius basically says Christianity preys upon the lowest and worst of society. Women, uneducated, children, slaves. And Christians are like kind of guilty as charged.
Yeah.
Like we aren't preying upon them, but yeah, we open the doors and these are the people that come in.
Yeah, so they just start with the people that God brings them. They go into the highways and the hedges, so to speak, and bring people in. That's okay. So it's, I mean, this is mind-blowingly interesting. But radical equality, the Spirit in everyone, healing and acts of power for the sake of, could we call it like the common good or the new creation?
Yeah, goodness, new creation.
What else? What are the other characteristics that we would notice?
I mean, one of the biggest things is hope. For example, Rome by the time of Jesus and Paul, Rome had been around for a while, but they believed that Rome's glory had been fading because Rome was too successful. They started to get lazy and fat and complacent. They weren't hungry to succeed. And so Rome developed what's called the Golden Age narrative, this idea that way back with Romulus and Remus and all of that, you have this golden age and then a narrative of decline. And then there was this belief, we need a new ruler who's going to
make Rome great again.
Rome great again. You got there. You got there.
I've been there the whole time.
So Virgil, famous for the Aeneid, was a huge supporter of Caesar Augustus and actually claimed that he was going to usher in a golden age. But the belief was, we don't know what the future is going to hold. We don't know what the gods have planned for us. And there was a famous tombstone saying that was on a lot of tombstones in the Roman world. And it's clever in Latin, but it's not clever in English. And it goes something like, I wasn't, meaning I didn't exist. I was, I am not, and I care not. So before I didn't exist, then I existed. Now I no longer exist, and who cares?
Right.
And many people think that was a way of saying people really just don't have certain hope in this world. They just don't. We don't know what the future is going to hold. One of the most popular things in the ancient world, like when you got a weekend, you got nothing to do, you would see an oracle, and you would pay an oracle to basically tell you your future. And you could ask really specific questions. I keep a catalog of these in my book. And one of them is like, I lost my pillow. Did I lose it or did someone steal it? Like stuff like that. So people were really curious about what's the unknown. Yeah. But the main point is the unknown is unknown.
Right.
And what Christians had, and Jews, of course, but what Christians had is with us, the future is known, not the details, but the certainty of it. And I think about today, Caleb, I think about what we're going through with ecology, and I do think we need practical solutions.
Yeah.
I think about what we're going through with politics, and I think that we should vote for the best leader. But I think about a really serious narrative of decline in the United States and around the world.
Yeah.
And I have teenagers, and they think the world is going down the tubes, and they might be right in the sense that things have seemed to have gotten worse over time, economics and other things, politics. But Christians, by nature, are hope-filled people.
Yeah.
One of the greatest gifts that we can give to the world is if God says there's an open door somewhere to a bright, positive future, we will be the first to find that door. Christians throughout history have been the greatest in science and technology because they believe in this open universe where anything is possible and we can make the world better. We cannot believe in a narrative decline.
Yeah.
Because we've been given a vision of the future.
Yeah. Oh, it's so powerful, man. And yet you go into so much of this in your book about, living in with a sense of the fullness of time. And you talk about, the ways that people worshiped and lifestyle things. I just want folks to go out and buy your book and read it, because we don't have time to talk about all the richness in there. But just kind of, I'm sure people will want to get it. But just as we wrap up, let's just talk about two things. The first would be, on the one hand, it's really easy to make the early church feel like they were perfect, or maybe we have a narrative of decline from the early church, right? Yeah. They were awesome, and now we suck. What are we going to do?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about essentially just why that's not the right way to think about it, and then let's just talk about takeaways, bottom line.
Yeah, sure. I actually have a chapter in my book, which I think you're alluding to, called "The Christians Were Not Perfect," and I put that in right at the end. And some people have said that's a terrible way to end the book, but I think it's a symbol of being self-critical as Christians. And so I as I put on my historian hat and I say, if I weren't a Christian, what would I accuse the Christians of legitimately? So I talk about things like slavery, like I wish, and they're more I wishes. I don't want to say they were darn dirty sinners, but I want to say there's some I wishes. I wish that they didn't support slavery. Now, I've heard a line, they didn't know any better. I've been reading up. There were some groups that didn't have slavery and were convictional about it. For example, the Essenes Jewish community didn't have slaves. There were some Germanic tribal people that didn't have slaves, that knew of slavery around the world. So it's not a crazy idea at the time, even though slavery was the norm. Second, Christians fought with each other all the time.
Yeah, you do see that a lot in the Bible.
Read 1 Corinthians, read Galatians. Yeah. I remember reading this book that I have here, a big 600-page book, and it talked about the counter mission against Paul. We think of Paul, this great hero, and he's my hero. And there was a whole group of Christians. Their whole job was to take Paul down.
Wow.
Galatians, Colossians, Philippians, the super apostles, second Corinthians. So they fought with each other. They fought they fought to the death in some ways, in the sense of accusing each other of heresy and all that. And one of the things, and maybe I didn't say it as well as I could have, but negative stereotyping. I said slander, but I'd probably better say negative stereotyping. Paul says all Cretans are liars. That could be taken the wrong way.
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to say, I believe all scripture is true. I believe it's inspired, but I don't think we have to mimic all the cultural forms of what they say and do.
Sure.
And I want to say, for as many times as we read something like all Jews will be punished for their killing Jesus or whatever, in Book of Acts, we also read Paul say, let your speech be seasoned with salt. Be reasonable in your conversation. Be gentle with all. So that's a little bit of a cautionary tale to say we shouldn't mimic every single thing in the New Testament.
Yeah. And it was a community that was growing, and to the degree that these things like radical equality and everyone's full of the Spirit and healings are happening and hope is bursting forth and they're getting pulled towards the future, to the degree that all that is taking place, there's going to be development, which is not the same thing as progress, but there is development and sort of different enculturation over time. It's just helpful to remember because, we can, I just, any one of us who's ever led in a church or any setting where you're working with actual real life disciples of Jesus in, the 21st century, we can feel so far from the kinds of things that you're describing. So I appreciate the cautionary tale, but let's end on a note, essentially just going back to the biggest question of why would you write a book like this? I imagine at one very fundamental level, it's to bless and inspire and goad the church. So what would you want to say to the Vineyard coming out of this as folks read your book?
Yeah. When we say, why do we look so different from our spiritual ancestors today in some ways? Why do we look so different morally or religiously or things like that? I think in every generation, there's the temptation. It's almost like the wider culture is a big magnet. And if you aren't holding your ground. I don't think we should have an oppositional stance towards culture. But if there's the Jesus way and then there's the world's way, and the world's way is like a huge magnet, there's always going to be this pull, and you always got to be recognizing whether you are clinging to Jesus or not. So think about it this way. Imagine we as people are like big Lego towers. And what happens is often I think that we just slap Jesus on the outside, or we put a Jesus robe on it and say, this is Christian. And what I think is different about these early Christians, and I get this from Philippians 3, where Paul says, I suffered the loss of all things. And he's talking about his Jewishness. He's talking about his heritage. He doesn't lose them forever. But what he's saying is, I have to take every part of my life apart and put it back together, reoriented around Jesus. So think about, let's say you're made up of 10,000 Lego pieces. Pulling every single piece off, cataloging it and saying, has this thing been baptized in Jesus Christ? Has this thing been converted to Jesus Christ? Has this thing claimed allegiance to love of God and love of neighbor? Does this thing have faith? And then putting it back. And then maybe say, okay, I don't want this thing because that's hedonism, or that's, selfish or whatever. I don't think we do that. When I look at the discourse on social media between Christians or by Christians, I think have they ever read the Sermon on the Mount? Like, when I see what the kinds of things that people say and do, where we all scoff and we say those Christians don't represent Jesus. When I hear Gandhi, supposedly say, "I like your Christ, but I don't like your Christians. I wish your Christians were more like your Christ." It's because we haven't taken apart the whole thing and said, I need to look at every single piece. For the past 4 or 5 years, I've been seeing a spiritual director. This is basically what we do.
Yeah.
We just take apart my life and we put it back together, saying, have I actually soaked this piece in the blood of Jesus?
Yeah.
Have I infused this with the Spirit? I know that's not super practical, but that I think is the driving part of these early Christians.
Well, I think it's entirely practical, because where there are places in our lives that we feel a sense of the conviction of the Spirit, or even just question marks, like about whether or not my life should look more like the life of Jesus in a certain way. I mean, what you're describing is that the church was born not in conformity to the culture, not in even, frankly, relevance to the culture, but was born in a kind of self-interrogating, submitted relationship to Jesus that said Jesus first and then everything else.
Yep.
And there was a very, very high cost for that for some, but in paying that cost, the Jesus way became the worldwide phenomenon of Christian faith.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Nijay, it's been so great to talk to you today. Thanks so much for not just your time, but thanks for the work that you're doing and the ways that work is helping us. I really appreciate it so much, man.
My pleasure. Great conversation.
Come talk to us again.
As we celebrate our 50-year anniversary in the Vineyard, if you're interested in learning more about Vineyard history, there are plenty of resources for you. Check out our show notes for links to books, YouTube videos, and more to learn about Vineyard history and identity. And make sure to keep listening to the podcast this year for stories of Vineyard churches throughout the year.